The Cold War did not happen the way most people remember it. It was not a long standoff between two powers that disagreed about economics. It was not a chess match between rational actors who understood the risks and carefully avoided them. It was something far more unsettling. It was a sustained period of institutional violence conducted in near-total silence, managed by bureaucracies that had normalized the idea of ending civilization as an acceptable operational outcome. The weapons were real. The plans were real. The near misses were real. What was largely absent was the kind of human oversight that the public assumed was in place at every moment. What filled that absence was procedure, protocol, automated logic, and a level of secrecy so deep that the people most responsible for preventing catastrophe often had no idea how close catastrophe actually was. Most histories of this period emphasize what did not happen. The bombs were not dropped. The missiles did not fly. The war, in the conventional sense, never began. And from a distance, that outcome can be made to look like wisdom, like restraint, like two superpowers pulling themselves back from the edge through careful judgment and measured decision-making. But the closer you look at the actual record, the more that interpretation dissolves. What you find instead is a series of accidents, miscalculations, equipment failures, communications breakdowns, and individual acts of unauthorized restraint that, taken together, describe not a system that worked, but a system that happened not to fail. The distinction matters enormously because the systems that came so close to triggering a nuclear exchange were never dismantled. They were inherited. They are still with us in modified form. And understanding how they functioned and how often they nearly did not is the only honest way to understand what the Cold War actually was. The first thing to understand is the scale of what was built. By the early 1960s, the United States had deployed thousands of nuclear warheads across dozens of countries, aboard submarines running silent patrol routes beneath the Atlantic and Pacific, aboard aircraft kept airborne around the clock, and in hardened silos scattered across the American interior. The Soviet Union had built a comparable architecture of destruction on its own side. Each system was designed with the assumption that the other side might strike first, without warning, and that the ability to respond with overwhelming force had to be guaranteed regardless of what happened in the opening moments of a conflict. That logic, known as assured destruction, required that the weapons be kept in a state of constant readiness, not readiness measured in days or hours, but readiness measured in minutes, and maintaining that kind of readiness over decades, across tens of thousands of warheads, operated by hundreds of thousands of personnel in conditions of extreme secrecy and extreme stress, produced a category of risk that no planning document ever fully accounted for. That risk was the human margin of error, compounded by mechanical failure, multiplied by time. Project A119 was one of the first indications of how far institutional thinking had drifted from anything resembling ordinary judgment. In the late 1950s, the United States Air Force commissioned a classified study to examine the feasibility of detonating a nuclear weapon on the surface of the moon. The rationale, such as it was, involved demonstrating American technological superiority at a moment when the Soviet Union had just launched Sputnik, and the psychological dimension of the space race had become inseparable from the military competition. The idea was that a visible nuclear detonation on the lunar surface, seen through telescopes by observers across the Earth, would serve as an unmistakable demonstration of American reach and American resolve. The study was conducted in secret, assigned to a team that included a young Carl Sagan among others, and it proceeded with the full institutional seriousness that characterized most Cold War weapons analysis. The project was eventually abandoned, not primarily because it was recognized as an act of profound irrationality, but because of concerns that a failed launch might result in nuclear contamination of Earth's atmosphere, and because of the growing realization that a successful moon landing would be a more compelling demonstration of power than a nuclear explosion. The fact that the project existed at all, that it was taken seriously, staffed by credentialed scientists, and advanced to the point of detailed feasibility study, tells you something important about the intellectual environment in which Cold War weapons decisions were made. The same environment produced Project Pluto. This was a program run by the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory beginning in 1957 with the goal of developing a nuclear-powered cruise missile. The concept involved a missile propelled by a nuclear ramjet engine, a device that worked by forcing air through a nuclear reactor core at supersonic speed, heating it to enormous temperatures, and expelling it to generate thrust. The missile was designed to fly at low altitude at supersonic speed for essentially unlimited range, because it carried its own fuel source in the form of a compact nuclear reactor. It would be guided to its targets by an onboard navigation system, and it would deliver conventional nuclear warheads along its flight path. What the designers also acknowledged, with something approaching equanimity, was that the missile's exhaust would itself be lethally radioactive. A Pluto missile flying over populated territory would irradiate everything beneath it simply by passing overhead. It would be, in the language of one internal assessment, a flying reactor spewing fission products. The program built 2 working reactor prototypes, both of which were successfully tested in the Nevada desert. The missile was never deployed, ultimately because the Air Force concluded that intercontinental ballistic missiles were a more practical delivery system. But the engineering was real, the tests were conducted, and the radioactive exhaust problem was considered a secondary concern rather than a fundamental disqualification. Project Pluto was cancelled in 1964. But the reactors it built remained radioactive for decades afterward, stored in the Nevada desert waiting for a disposal solution that took years to arrive. While Pluto was being tested in Nevada, a parallel category of nightmare was developing in the realm of command and control. The fundamental problem facing both superpowers was this: a nuclear strike might be delivered so quickly and with such devastating effect on command infrastructure that the leadership capable of authorizing retaliation might be eliminated in the opening moments of a war. This created what strategists called the decapitation problem. If the president, the defense secretary, and the entire chain of command could be killed before they had time to authorize a retaliatory strike, the deterrent value of the entire nuclear arsenal was undermined. The solution, pursued by both sides with varying degrees of technical sophistication, was to pre-delegate launch authority, to distribute it, to build systems capable of authorizing nuclear launches without waiting for a human decision at the top. In the United States, this took several forms, some of which remain classified in their full details even today. In the Soviet Union, it eventually produced one of the most extraordinary pieces of Cold War engineering ever constructed, a system the Soviets called Perimeter, and which Western analysts would later call Dead Hand. Perimeter was designed to solve the decapitation problem in the most direct possible way. It was a semi-automated command and control system that could, under certain conditions, authorize the launch of the entire Soviet nuclear arsenal without direct human intervention at the highest levels. The system worked roughly as follows. If Soviet command centers detected nuclear detonations on Soviet territory, and if communication with senior leadership was disrupted or destroyed, Perimeter would begin a sequence of verification checks. It would assess whether a nuclear attack was underway. It would attempt to contact senior leadership. If those contacts failed, and the system concluded that it was operating in a post-attack environment, it would activate a special command rocket, a relatively simple missile whose purpose was not to carry a warhead, but to carry a launch command. This command rocket would fly over Soviet ICBM fields, broadcasting an authenticated launch order, and the missiles in those fields would fire. The system was designed to function even if every human being with normal launch authority had been killed. It was, in the most literal sense, a machine that could decide to end civilization. The Soviets began deploying it in 1985. It almost certainly remains operational in some form today. The existence of Perimeter was not publicly confirmed until 1993, when a former Soviet colonel described it to an American journalist. The American government's reaction to this disclosure was revealing in its own way. Officials acknowledged that they had been aware of the system's existence through intelligence channels. They also acknowledged that the prospect of such a system had been considered in American strategic planning, and that analogous capabilities existed on the American side in the form of pre-delegated launch authorities and emergency action procedures that did not require presidential authorization under certain defined conditions. The specific parameters of those American procedures remain classified. What is known is that both superpowers, at various points during the Cold War, deliberately constructed systems designed to remove human judgment from the most consequential decision any civilization could make. The Able Archer 83 exercise nearly tested those systems in a way that no one had planned. In November of 1983, NATO conducted a large-scale military exercise designed to practice the procedures for escalating from conventional to nuclear war in Europe. The exercise involved genuine communications between real command centers, used authentic codes and procedures, and simulated a realistic political crisis culminating in a nuclear release decision. From the outside, from the perspective of Soviet intelligence services monitoring NATO communications, the exercise was very difficult to distinguish from an actual preparation for a nuclear first strike. The Soviet leadership in 1983 was already operating under extraordinary levels of institutional paranoia. Yuri Andropov, the General Secretary, was gravely ill and deeply convinced that the Reagan administration was preparing a preemptive attack. The KGB had launched a worldwide intelligence operation called Ryan, specifically to collect indicators of an imminent American nuclear strike. When Able Archer 83 began, Soviet intelligence services began reporting to Moscow that the indicators they had been trained to look for were appearing. Soviet nuclear forces in Eastern Europe were placed on higher alert. Some Soviet aircraft were loaded with nuclear weapons and placed on standby. For a period of days, portions of the Soviet military establishment genuinely believed they might be witnessing the beginning of a nuclear war. The exercise ended. The Soviets stood down. The crisis passed without a single public statement, a single press conference, or a single acknowledgement from either government that anything unusual had occurred. The full seriousness of what had happened was not communicated to the Reagan White House in real time. President Reagan reportedly learned of how close the situation had come only afterward, through a briefing based in part on intelligence provided by a British agent inside the KGB named Oleg Gordievsky, who had himself been present in London watching Soviet communications during the exercise and had been genuinely alarmed by what he saw. The year 1983 was already saturated with near-catastrophic incidents before Able Archer. In September of that year, a Soviet lieutenant colonel named Stanislav Petrov was serving as the duty officer at Serpukhov 15, a secret command center south of Moscow, responsible for monitoring Soviet early warning satellites. Shortly after midnight on September 26th, the early warning system reported that the United States had launched a nuclear missile at the Soviet Union. Then it reported a second launch, then a third, a fourth, and a fifth. The system's confidence indicator was reading at its highest level. Petrov had minutes to make a decision. The protocol he was operating under was clear: report the attack up the chain of command, which would trigger the Soviet response. But Petrov did not follow the protocol. He looked at the data and concluded, based partly on logic and partly on instinct, that the alert was a false alarm. His reasoning was straightforward in retrospect, but required extraordinary composure in the moment. A genuine American first strike would not consist of 5 missiles. If the Americans were going to launch, they would launch everything. 5 missiles made no strategic sense. He reported the alert as a system malfunction. He was correct. The satellite had misidentified sunlight reflecting off cloud formations as the exhaust plumes of ascending ICBMs. Had Petrov followed procedure, the Soviet Union might have launched a retaliatory strike against the United States, while the United States had not, in fact, attacked. What prevented it was one man's decision to trust his judgment over his protocol. That decision was made in about 12 minutes. Petrov was later reprimanded for failing to follow proper reporting procedures. Earlier in the same year, on the other side of the planet, a sequence of events was unfolding that would later be described as one of the most dangerous nuclear incidents of the Cold War. On March the 2nd, 1983, a United States Navy submarine, the USS Skipjack, was operating in Soviet territorial waters as part of a classified intelligence-gathering program. The program, which had been running in various forms since the 1960s, involved American submarines penetrating deep into Soviet-controlled sea lanes, approaching Soviet naval bases, and collecting intelligence on Soviet submarine operations, communications, and capabilities. The submarines operating in these missions ran silent, maintained strict emissions control, and operated under rules of engagement that authorized lethal action if cornered or forced to surface. On this particular operation, the Skipjack was tracking a Soviet submarine in the Barents Sea when Soviet anti-submarine forces began an intensive search pattern that came dangerously close to the American boat. The details of what happened next remain classified. What is known from partial declassification is that the Skipjack was at risk of detection for a period of several hours, that depth charges were used nearby by Soviet forces, and that the crew operated under conditions of genuine uncertainty about whether they had been located. No contact was ultimately established. The Skipjack returned to port. The incident was logged, classified, and filed. The Soviets never formally acknowledged it. The American government never acknowledged it publicly. It joined a long list of classified near misses that accumulated throughout the Cold War without ever entering the public record. The nuclear submarine program itself was a sustained exercise in normalized danger. American and Soviet submarines spent decades tracking each other in the deep ocean, sometimes at ranges of only a few thousand yards, operating under orders that would have authorized attack with little warning in the event of an actual conflict. The intensity of this underwater competition produced collisions, near collisions, and a category of incident that both navies referred to using deliberately understated language. In 1968, the USS Scorpion was lost in the Atlantic with all hands. The official cause was determined to be an internal mechanical failure, but the circumstances of the loss have never been fully clarified, and the submarine's final hours remain imperfectly understood. In the same year, the Soviets lost the K-129, a Gulf-class ballistic missile submarine that sank in the Pacific under circumstances that remain disputed. The United States Navy, which had been tracking the K-129, knew where it was. The CIA subsequently mounted a highly classified operation to recover the sunken submarine using a specially constructed deep-sea salvage ship called the Hughes Glomar Explorer, nominally a commercial vessel secretly built and operated by the intelligence community. The operation, called Project Azorian, successfully recovered a portion of the K-129 from a depth of nearly 17,000 feet in 1974. What was recovered included nuclear warhead components, Soviet codebooks, and the bodies of several Soviet sailors, who were given a burial at sea, conducted with military honors, and filmed on instructions from CIA Director William Colby. The film of that burial was eventually passed to the Russian government after the Cold War ended. The Soviets had never been told what happened to their submarine or their crew. Project Azorian was not the most audacious American intelligence operation of the Cold War, which is a remarkable statement given its nature. The most audacious may have been a program known as Ivy Bells, which involved American Navy divers attaching recording devices directly to Soviet undersea communications cables in the Sea of Okhotsk, in waters that were considered by the Soviets to be effectively sovereign. The cables carried communications between Soviet naval installations, and the recordings they produced gave American intelligence an extraordinary window into Soviet naval operations and communication security practices. The program ran successfully for years, with divers periodically returning to the cable sites to replace recording devices and retrieve the stored data. It was eventually compromised not by Soviet counterintelligence, but by an employee of the National Security Agency named Ronald Pelton, who sold the program's details to the KGB in 1980. Pelton had not worked on Ivy Bells directly, but had sufficient access to signals intelligence programs to understand what was being collected and where. When the Soviets went to the cable site and found the American recording pod, they removed it and put it on public display at a Moscow museum, where it can still be seen. The Americans were informed that the program had been compromised when the Soviets found the device. The internal investigation that identified Pelton as the source took several more years. He was arrested in 1985. The intelligence competition operated on land as well as at sea, and some of its most extraordinary episodes involved the physical penetration of Soviet territory at a time when such penetration was considered an act of war. Operation Overflight, which most people know in connection with the shoot-down of Francis Gary Powers in a U-2 reconnaissance aircraft in 1960, was actually the visible surface of a much larger program of aerial reconnaissance that had been running since the early 1950s. What is less well known is the extent to which both superpowers were regularly penetrating each other's airspace with aircraft that were not always easily distinguishable from bombers. The shoot-down of Powers was not the first time that American reconnaissance aircraft had been brought down over Soviet territory. Between 1950 and 1960, approximately 40 American aircraft on reconnaissance missions were shot down or went missing over Soviet-controlled territory. Most of the incidents were classified. The crews who were captured were not acknowledged by the American government. For years, their families were told only that the aircraft had been lost in accidents. Some of the crews were held in Soviet prisons for years without the American government publicly demanding their release, because doing so would have required acknowledging that the flights were happening. Several were never accounted for and may have died in Soviet captivity. The moral architecture of this silence was replicated across dozens of programs that constituted the actual operational texture of the Cold War. Project MKUltra, the CIA's program of research into mind control and behavioral manipulation, began in 1953 and continued in various forms until at least 1973. The program involved experiments on human subjects, some of whom were volunteers, many of whom were not. Subjects were given LSD and other psychoactive substances without their knowledge or consent. Some were subjected to prolonged isolation, sensory deprivation, sleep deprivation, and other forms of psychological stress. Several subjects experienced permanent psychological damage. At least one, an army biochemist named Frank Olson, died under circumstances that the CIA officially described as a suicide following a breakdown, but which subsequent investigations have suggested may have involved something more deliberate. The program produced no reliable techniques for mind control. What it produced instead was a body of classified documentation that was largely destroyed on orders from CIA Director Richard Helms in 1973, when it became clear that congressional investigations might expose the program. The destruction of those documents was itself a federal crime. No one was prosecuted for it. What remained after the destruction, recovered years later through a Freedom of Information Act request that located documents stored in a different filing system from the main records, formed the basis of the public understanding of the program that exists today. The assumption that mind control was achievable, that human beings could be reliably programmed to act against their own interests and loyalties, was not unique to MKUltra. The Soviets ran parallel programs under the NKVD and its successor organizations. Both programs reflected a deeper institutional belief that the human mind was a system that could be engineered, and that engineering it was a legitimate weapons development goal. That belief was not aberrant. It was mainstream within the intelligence establishments of both superpowers, reviewed and funded by serious people in senior positions, and shielded from external scrutiny by the same classification systems that protected more conventional weapons programs. The parallel between MKUltra and the nuclear weapons programs is instructive. In both cases, the work was conducted in secret, justified by the logic of the adversarial competition, and insulated from the ethical review that would have been applied to comparable research in any non-classified context. In both cases, the secrecy itself became a mechanism of unaccountability. allowing programs to continue long past any rational assessment of their usefulness. The nuclear weapons development programs produced their own category of secret consequence. The test program that detonated hundreds of nuclear weapons in the atmosphere between 1945 and 1963 released quantities of radioactive fallout that contaminated populations across the continental United States, the Pacific, and parts of Asia and Europe. The populations living downwind of the Nevada test site, who came to be known collectively as the downwinders, were exposed to fallout from atmospheric nuclear tests for more than a decade. The Atomic Energy Commission, which oversaw the testing program, conducted studies of the health effects on these populations but classified the results and provided the public with systematic reassurances that the testing posed no significant health risk. Internal documents declassified years later showed that agency officials knew the reassurances were not fully consistent with the data they were collecting. Communities in Utah, Nevada, and Arizona experienced elevated rates of leukemia and thyroid cancer that were statistically distinguishable from background rates. The government denied the connection for decades. The Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, which acknowledged the government's responsibility and provided compensation to affected individuals, was not passed until 1990, nearly 3 decades after atmospheric testing ended. The testing program's effects extended far beyond the American Southwest. Operation Castle, a series of thermonuclear tests conducted at Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands in 1954, included a test called Castle Bravo that produced a yield nearly 3 times larger than predicted, releasing fallout that contaminated a vast area of the Pacific Ocean and the crew of a Japanese fishing vessel called the Lucky Dragon No. 5. The crew showed symptoms of acute radiation sickness. 1 crew member died. The fallout from Castle Bravo was detectable across a wide area of the Pacific and ultimately contaminated fish caught throughout the region. The incident produced an international incident and contributed to growing public opposition to atmospheric testing. But the United States government's initial response was to classify information about the test's yield and to question the health claims being made by the Japanese. The political management of the fallout, in both the literal and figurative sense, consumed more institutional energy than the safety of the affected populations. The Marshall Islands themselves had been designated as what the Atomic Energy Commission called the most isolated place in the world by United States officials who selected it as a test site in 1946. The Marshallese people who lived on Bikini Atoll were relocated by American naval officers and told that their sacrifice was for the good of mankind and to end all world wars. They were moved to Rongerik Atoll, which was considerably smaller than Bikini and had inadequate food resources, and they were essentially left there while the tests proceeded. After the testing program ended, American officials told the Bikinians that their home island was safe to return to, which it was not. Residents who returned developed high rates of radiation-related illness. The island was eventually deemed uninhabitable again in 1978, more than 30 years after the first test, and the Bikini Islanders remain unable to permanently return to their home island to this day. The trust fund established by the United States government to compensate them has been the subject of decades of dispute over adequacy. The exposure of human beings to nuclear and radiological hazards without their informed consent was not limited to civilian populations living near test sites. The American military conducted a series of programs throughout the 1950s that deliberately exposed soldiers to nuclear explosions to study the psychological and operational effects of nuclear combat. In exercises like Desert Rock, infantry units were marched toward ground zero of nuclear detonations shortly after the explosions, while the clouds of radioactive material were still visible and settling. The stated purpose was to assess whether soldiers could operate effectively in a post-nuclear environment and to desensitize them to the psychological impact of nuclear explosions. The unstated consequence was that tens of thousands of American veterans were exposed to radiation at levels that subsequent analysis suggested were higher than the safety standards of the time acknowledged. Hundreds of thousands of American and British servicemen who participated in nuclear testing programs were subsequently denied veterans' benefits related to radiation exposure on the grounds that the government could not establish a causal connection between the exposures and their health conditions. Many of them died, while that determination remained unresolved. Against this backdrop, the development of tactical nuclear weapons represented a particular form of institutional escalation. Tactical nuclear weapons, designed for use on the battlefield rather than against strategic targets, were deployed to Europe by the thousands throughout the Cold War. They were stored in bunkers in West Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Italy. They were designed to be used against Soviet conventional forces in the event of a Warsaw Pact invasion of Western Europe, and their use was incorporated into NATO military planning at an operational level that assumed the authorization question would be resolved quickly and under extreme battlefield pressure. The scenarios developed for the use of these weapons acknowledged explicitly that their detonation in populated European countries would kill enormous numbers of European civilians. The weapons were defended on the grounds that their very existence would deter a Soviet invasion, but the operational plans for their use existed alongside that deterrent logic, and the people who wrote those plans understood that there was a genuine possibility they might be executed. By the early 1980s, the United States had deployed approximately 7,000 tactical nuclear weapons in Europe alone. The SIOP, the Single Integrated Operational Plan that governed the targeting of American nuclear weapons, was a document of extraordinary and largely hidden violence. The first version of the SIOP, developed in 1960, targeted more than 1,000 Soviet, Chinese, and Eastern European cities and military installations for simultaneous nuclear attack. Early assessments suggested that executing the plan as written would kill between 360 and 525 million people in the first few days, with hundreds of millions more dying subsequently from fallout and the disruption of food and medical systems. The SIOP was developed by the Strategic Air Command, largely without input from the State Department, the Civilian Defense Establishment, or the White House. When Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara saw a briefing on it in 1961, he reportedly left the room immediately afterward and said nothing for several minutes. The plan was eventually revised under civilian pressure, but the revision process was slow, contested, and incomplete. Elements of the original targeting philosophy persisted through multiple revisions. The SIOP remained a classified document throughout the Cold War, unavailable for public review or democratic accountability. The planning culture that produced the SIOP also produced the concept of mutual assured destruction as a stable deterrent condition, a theory that required both sides to accept, at an institutional and psychological level, the premise that the mass murder of civilian populations was a legitimate and rational strategic tool. The architects of this doctrine were serious, educated, and in many cases brilliant people. Herman Kahn wrote 1,000-page documents analyzing nuclear war scenarios with the same tone and methodology that might be applied to cost-benefit analyses of industrial infrastructure. His work was not considered extremist within the strategic planning community. It was considered mainstream. The Rand Corporation, which employed many of the people who shaped American nuclear strategy, produced studies of nuclear war and post-nuclear recovery with clinical detachment that obscured the fact that what was being analyzed was the organized destruction of human civilization. The detachment was, in a sense, a survival mechanism. The people doing this work needed to be able to do it, and that required them to maintain an emotional distance from its subject matter that might, in other contexts, be described as dissociation. The psychological burden of maintaining that detachment across decades, across hundreds of institutions and hundreds of thousands of individuals, produced its own category of systemic risk. Accidents, errors, and close calls accumulated not only because systems failed, but because the people operating those systems were under forms of stress that were almost never acknowledged and never systematically addressed. Launch control officers sitting in Minuteman missile silos, responsible for the physical execution of nuclear launches, were given psychological screening and ongoing evaluation, but the fundamental absurdity of their position, the expectation that they would, if ordered, participate in the killing of millions of people, was never part of the official conversation about their fitness for duty. Many of them later described the work as an exercise in sustained cognitive dissonance, a permanent gap between the official framing of their mission as defensive and their clear understanding of what the mission would actually involve. The 1961 Goldsboro B-52 crash is perhaps the most direct illustration of the gap between official reassurance and operational reality that characterized the entire nuclear enterprise. On January 24, 1961, a B-52 Stratofortress carrying 2 Mark 39 thermonuclear bombs broke up in midair over Goldsboro, North Carolina, after developing a fuel leak. The aircraft and its crew were lost. The 2 nuclear bombs it was carrying fell free and descended toward the ground. One of the bombs deployed its parachute and landed relatively gently in a tree. The other did not deploy its parachute and hit the ground at high speed, burying components deep in the marshy soil. Both bombs were armed. Investigators examining the weapons after recovery found that in one of the bombs, 3 of the 4 safety mechanisms had failed during the fall. The single remaining mechanism that had prevented detonation was a simple, low-voltage switch. A single point of failure between the survival of Goldsboro, North Carolina, and a nuclear detonation with a yield of approximately 4 megatons stood between that morning and an event that would have killed an unknown but very large number of people and fundamentally altered American history. The incident was classified. The official public position of the Atomic Energy Commission for years afterward was that the weapons it oversaw were equipped with reliable safety systems. The document in which an analyst described the near detonation, a memorandum by nuclear weapons safety expert Parker Jones, was declassified only in 2013, more than 50 years after the crash. One of the bomb's components, buried in the soft ground near Faro, North Carolina, was never recovered. It remains there. The Goldsboro incident was not unique. Declassified records eventually enumerated a category of incidents that the Air Force and the Atomic Energy Commission called broken arrows, defined as incidents involving nuclear weapons that included accidental launches, firings, detonations, thefts, or losses of nuclear weapons or nuclear components. By the official count, there were 32 such incidents between 1950 and 1980. Independent researchers examining partially declassified records have suggested the actual number may be considerably higher. In 1966, a B-52 collided with a KC-135 tanker aircraft over Palomares, Spain, scattering 4 hydrogen bombs. 2 of the bomb's conventional explosive components detonated on impact with the ground, dispersing plutonium over a wide area of Spanish farmland. 2 other bombs fell into the Mediterranean Sea, one of which was eventually recovered after a 3-month search. In 1968, another B-52 crashed near Thule Air Base in Greenland, again carrying thermonuclear weapons. The conventional explosives in at least one weapon detonated, spreading plutonium contamination across the sea ice. The cleanup operations at both sites were extensive, classified, and in the case of Palomares, complicated by American government reluctance to acknowledge the full extent of the contamination to the Spanish authorities and the affected population. Decades later, surveys of the Palomares area continued to find elevated levels of plutonium contamination, and residents of the region were still seeking comprehensive health monitoring and cleanup assistance from the American government. The organizational culture that processed broken arrows as manageable operational incidents rather than as evidence of fundamental system failure was the same culture that produced Project 112 and Project Shad, a series of chemical and biological weapons tests conducted between 1962 and 1973 that used American military personnel as uninformed test subjects. The tests involved spraying ships and their crews with simulants and in some cases actual chemical and biological agents to assess the vulnerability of naval platforms and personnel to such attacks. thousands of sailors and soldiers were exposed. They were not told what they were being exposed to. Many of them later developed health conditions that appeared consistent with exposure to the agents used in the tests. For decades, the Defense Department denied that the tests had involved actual toxic agents and denied access to test records. A partial accounting of the programs was released in the early 2000s following congressional pressure, but the full record of which agents were used, in what quantities, and against which units has never been comprehensively declassified. Veterans attempting to establish service-connected disability claims related to their participation in these tests faced the same systematic obstruction that confronted nuclear test veterans. The government that had used them as experimental subjects declined to provide the records that would have supported their claims. The Soviet counterpart to Project Shad was Biopreparat, a program of biological weapons development that operated under cover of a civilian public health organization, and that, by the time of the Soviet Union's collapse, employed more than 60,000 scientists and technicians working on the weaponization of some of the most dangerous pathogens known to exist. Biopreparat was not known to Western intelligence in its true scope until after the Cold War, when Soviet defectors, including a senior official named Ken Alibek, provided detailed accounts of what had been produced. The program had successfully weaponized anthrax, smallpox, plague, and a range of other pathogens. It had developed delivery systems including cruise missiles and aircraft-dispersed aerosol bombs. It had, by Alibek's account, continued to operate in violation of the 1972 Biological Weapons Convention, to which the Soviet Union was a signatory throughout the remainder of the Cold War and into the early years of the post-Soviet period. The accident at Sverdlovsk in 1979, in which an accidental release of anthrax from a Soviet military facility killed at least 64 people and possibly many more, was concealed from the Soviet public and denied to Western governments for more than a decade. The Soviet explanation, maintained through multiple rounds of diplomatic inquiry, was that the deaths had resulted from contaminated meat. Western intelligence agencies were skeptical of that explanation, but lacked the evidence to definitively refute it until after the fall of the Soviet Union, when Russian President Boris Yeltsin acknowledged the true cause in 1992. The management of classified information within both superpowers created not only external deceptions, but internal ones. Situations in which critical information was withheld from decision-makers at the highest levels, not by foreign adversaries, but by their own bureaucratic systems. One of the most consequential examples of this involves the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, which is commonly presented as an example of successful crisis management, but which, on closer examination, contains several moments where catastrophe was avoided, not through wisdom, but through the specific decisions of individuals operating outside the official decision-making structures. During the 13 days of the crisis, a Soviet submarine designated B-59 was operating in the Atlantic, targeted by American anti-submarine forces who were dropping depth charges to force it to surface. The submarine's communications with Moscow had been cut off. Its crew did not know whether a war had started. The submarine was armed with a nuclear-tipped torpedo, and the weapons release procedures required the agreement of 3 officers: the captain, the political officer, and the executive officer. The captain, Valentin Savitsky, convinced that a war was underway, ordered the nuclear torpedo prepared for launch. The political officer concurred. The executive officer, Vasily Arkhipov, refused. His refusal prevented the launch. Had Arkhipov agreed, a Soviet nuclear torpedo would have been fired against American naval vessels in the Atlantic at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, with consequences that can only be estimated, but that could very plausibly have included a nuclear exchange. Arkhipov's decision was not known to American officials at the time. It was not known to Soviet officials in Moscow. It became publicly known only decades later, when the Cold War was over and the crew members were in a position to speak. When Robert McNamara, who had been Secretary of Defense during the crisis, learned of the incident, he reportedly said that the world had come far closer to nuclear war than he had understood at the time. The Cuban Missile Crisis also revealed the extent to which the Kennedy administration was operating on the basis of incomplete and sometimes incorrect intelligence about Soviet capabilities and intentions. American U-2 photographs had revealed the presence of Soviet missiles in Cuba, but the photographs did not reveal the presence of Soviet tactical nuclear weapons also present on the island. Weapons that had been pre-delegated for use by Soviet commanders against an American invasion without requiring authorization from Moscow. Had the United States launched the invasion that a majority of Kennedy's advisors initially recommended, those weapons would almost certainly have been used. The American forces assaulting the Cuban beaches would have walked into tactical nuclear fire. Kennedy's decision to pursue a blockade rather than an invasion, made against the strong advice of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, prevented this scenario. It was one of the most consequential decisions of the Cold War, made in the context of a complete absence of information about the tactical nuclear weapons that made the alternative catastrophic. The information failures of the Cuban Missile Crisis were replicated in a different form during the Yom Kippur War of 1973, when a combination of military alerting, intelligence ambiguity, and bureaucratic miscommunication pushed American and Soviet forces toward a direct confrontation that was entirely invisible to the public while it was happening. In October 1973, as Israeli forces faced a serious military situation, American intelligence detected signals suggesting that the Soviet Union might be preparing to airlift troops to the region to intervene directly in the conflict. The Nixon administration, in the midst of the Watergate crisis and operating with degraded decision-making capacity at the highest levels, responded by raising American military readiness to DEFCON 3, a significant escalation that was detectable by Soviet intelligence and that carried its own escalation risks. Henry Kissinger, who was managing the crisis in the absence of effective presidential leadership, later described the period as one of the most dangerous of the entire Cold War. The Soviets stood down their preparations. The crisis passed. It was not reported to the American public in anything approaching its true seriousness while it was occurring. The pattern of institutional secrecy that characterized these episodes was not simply a product of Cold War necessity. It was, in many respects, a pre-existing condition of the national security bureaucracy that the Cold War vastly amplified. The tools of classification, compartmentalization, and information control that were developed to protect genuinely sensitive military information were routinely used to protect bureaucratic equities, to conceal embarrassing failures, and to prevent democratic accountability for decisions whose consequences would have been politically unacceptable if publicly known. The growth of the classification system over the Cold War period was itself a kind of institutional phenomenon. By the 1980s, the American government was classifying millions of documents per year, far more than could plausibly contain genuine national security information, and the system for reviewing and declassifying old material was so overwhelmed as to be functionally inoperative in most areas. Documents that had been classified in the 1950s as sensitive were still classified in the 1990s, not because anyone had reviewed them and concluded they remained sensitive, but because the review had never happened. Operation Northwoods, a plan developed by the Joint Chiefs of Staff in 1962, illustrates the kind of thinking that classification was protecting from public scrutiny. The plan was developed in response to the Kennedy administration's desire to find a pretext for military action against Cuba following the failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion. It proposed a series of false flag operations, activities that would be carried out by American forces or agents but attributed to Cuba that could provide a justification for invasion. The proposals included faking attacks on American military facilities, creating fake Cuban attacks on American citizens, staging the sinking of a ship and blaming Cuba, and shooting down or otherwise destroying an American aircraft in a manner that could be attributed to Cuban action. The plan was developed, reviewed, and formally submitted to Secretary of Defense McNamara, who rejected it without ever publicly disclosing that it had been proposed. President Kennedy was reportedly shown elements of the plan and rejected them. The plan remained classified for nearly 40 years until it was declassified in 1997 as part of the John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act. Its contents, when they became public, were shocking, not because false flag operations were unimaginable in the Cold War context, but because the plan had been developed to such a level of operational detail, reviewed through normal bureaucratic channels, and submitted as a serious policy proposal by the uniformed military leadership of the United States. The willingness of institutions to develop plans of this kind reflected a broader pattern in which the moral constraints that operated in public were systematically suspended in classified contexts. The Phoenix program in Vietnam, which was technically a Cold War operation and was framed in terms of Cold War logic, targeted an estimated 34,000 suspected Viet Cong operatives for assassination, capture, or other removal between 1965 and 1972. The program was run by the CIA in conjunction with the South Vietnamese government and American military units, and it operated through a network of provincial interrogation centers where practices that would constitute torture under any applicable legal standard were routinely employed. The program was partly revealed in congressional hearings in the early 1970s, but its full scope was never publicly examined in anything approaching a comprehensive legal proceeding. The institutional structures that had authorized and managed it continued to exist after Vietnam, staffed in many cases by the same people, applying in other contexts the operational lessons that had been developed there. The question of continuity is essential to understanding what the Cold War actually produced. It produced not just specific programs and weapons, but institutional cultures and operational philosophies that persisted independently of the specific Cold War context that had generated them. The networks of classified installations, the command and control structures, the pre-delegated launch authorities, the mass surveillance capabilities developed under programs like COINTELPRO domestically and a dozen similar programs abroad, all of these were built during the Cold War, and all of them continued to exist after it. The Soviet Union's collapse in 1991 did not trigger a comprehensive review of the systems, programs, and institutional cultures that had been built in response to it. The nuclear weapons remained, the command and control systems remained, the surveillance capabilities remained, the classification cultures remained. What ended was not the infrastructure of the Cold War, but the specific political context that had made its public defense possible. The final days of the Soviet Union produced their own category of near-catastrophic incident, one that received almost no public attention at the time and has received relatively little since. In January 1995, a Norwegian scientific rocket launched to study the aurora borealis was detected by Russian early warning systems and momentarily tracked as a possible American submarine-launched ballistic missile on a trajectory toward Moscow. The Russian military alerted President Boris Yeltsin, who was presented with the nuclear briefcase and had minutes to make a decision about a retaliatory launch. The alert lasted approximately 8 minutes before the rocket's trajectory was determined not to match that of an attacking missile. Norway had notified Russia through diplomatic channels of the planned rocket launch weeks in advance, but the notification had not been properly distributed within the Russian military command. Yeltsin chose not to launch a retaliatory strike. The episode was described afterward as the closest the world had come to nuclear war since the Cuban Missile Crisis. It occurred 4 years after the end of the Cold War. The persistence of these systems and risks beyond the political framework that had generated them is the most accurate description of what the Cold War's ending actually represented. The formal contest between the two superpowers, the competition for spheres of influence, the ideological confrontation, the proxy wars, all of these had a definite ending point in the early 1990s. But the infrastructure that the competition had created, the weapons, the institutions, the operational procedures, the classification cultures, the automated response systems, the psychological and organizational habits of the people and bureaucracies that had built and maintained all of it. These did not dissolve when the Soviet Union dissolved. They continued. They adapted. They were absorbed into new institutional contexts and new geopolitical frameworks. The warheads that were pointed at American cities during the Cold War were reduced in number through arms control agreements but not eliminated. The Russian nuclear arsenal today remains capable of destroying American civilization many times over, as does the American nuclear arsenal in relation to Russia. The command and control systems that were designed to function even after a decapitating first strike remain operational. The pre-delegated launch authorities, the automated response protocols, the procedures designed to remove human judgment from the most consequential decision available to any government, these remain in place in modified and updated form. The 22 projects and programs described here represent a cross-section of Cold War institutional behavior that was never fully visible to the populations whose lives and deaths they governed. The people who designed and operated these systems were not, for the most part, monsters. They were professionals, operating within institutional structures, following procedures, serving the interests as they understood them of the organizations and governments they worked for. The systems they built were rational responses to genuinely threatening conditions. The near catastrophes they produced were not the result of individual malice or irrationality, but of the accumulated logic of institutions doing what institutions do, pursuing their defined objectives, managing their defined risks, and insulating themselves from forms of accountability that might have interrupted either. The Cold War ended when one side's political and economic system collapsed under its own weight. The other side declared victory. The systems that had nearly destroyed the world multiple times, not through intention, but through the ordinary workings of institutional competition in conditions of extreme secrecy and extreme stakes, were not stood down. They were maintained, updated, and passed to the next generation of decision-makers who inherited them without having built them, and who operate them today under conditions of partial visibility and institutionalized uncertainty that would be entirely familiar to anyone who served within those systems at the height of the conflict that created them.